Well, it's what is written time. And I think we'll have time to address just one question. And that question is this: should Christians observe the Lord's Supper when unable to be amidst a local assembly of believers? That's a question that came up when COVID kind of shut everything down, and I told you that I didn't think that was the time to address that question. It's been raised more recently, and so we want to look at that question this morning. What we're really asking is it permissible for Christians to partake of the emblems of the Lord's Supper if they're sick at home and they can't assemble with the saints, or perhaps they're confined to a nursing home? Maybe they're traveling away from home and there is no local church close by. What if they're quarantined because of COVID? Or what if you make a trip overseas and there's no church for you to worship with? Maybe you're deployed in the military on board ship in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea or something. What if you're in prison? There are Christians in prison. Well, before we begin to address this question, there are some preliminary observations that I want to make. This is a controversial question, more controversial than perhaps you might realize. It is essentially a doctrinal question. And we will almost certainly not arrive at the same conclusion at the same time. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, especially when we're thinking about some difficult and controversial questions. It behooves all of us to approach this subject with open minds and open Bibles. In a tract that Brother James Needham wrote, entitled "The Woman's Covering," he was dealing with a completely different subject. But he said something that I agree with 100%. He says, it should not matter to us what God wants, and we should be anxious to do whatever He requires. That's the kind of attitude that we need to have regarding every Bible subject. I want to remind you that Christians are susceptible to prejudice, bitterness, and self-interest just like anybody else. And that's something that we need to guard against, something that we need to fight against. I would also remind you that disagreement almost always produces a degree of discomfort. You ever disagree with your wife? Mark says never. Let's see, next Sunday I'm going to preach on lying. Well, if you ever disagree with your mate, you understand that that often brings a degree of discomfort. Well, when Christians deal with difficult and controversial questions and they disagree about that, that brings some discomfort as well. Then finally, let me remind you that all of us must follow the dictates of our conscience. Whatsoever is not of faith is sin, Paul says in Romans chapter 14, verse 23. There are some words of warning that we need to heed anytime we discuss a difficult question. And they come from the same chapter in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 18:13 reads, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him." And then a few verses later, the wise man says, "The first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him." That's why we have a prosecutor and a defense attorney in the courtroom. We need to hear both sides of any question, and we need to consider both sides. we also need to realize that fallacious arguments can sound good on the surface. So we need to carefully consider any difficult question in light of what the Bible teaches. Well, I would not be surprised if at the end of this period of Bible study, some of you come up to me and you say, "Kevin, I'm so confused." I hope it's not because my presentation is difficult to understand. But let me say to you, or let me remind you, that in our judicial system, we expect ordinary people to listen to complicated testimony from the experts, weigh the evidence and the arguments, and determine guilt or innocence oftentimes when life and death hang in the balance. Don't we do that? Do this. We do that, don't we? Jesus said in John chapter 7 and verse 17, "If anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine whether it is from God or whether I speak on my own authority." If we really want to understand, if we really want to do God's will, I think we can come to an understanding of the truth. We may not do that immediately, but I do believe we can do that. Well, now then, I want to present a couple of arguments for the idea that when Christians partake of the Lord's Supper, it is something that they should do together. And that's my first point. The Lord's Supper is to be eaten when the church comes together. When Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper on the night of his betrayal, he and his apostles had gathered together to partake of the Passover. And it was in that setting that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And Luke tells us that the church in Troas came together to partake of the Lord's Supper. Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. Several times in Paul's instructions to the church at Corinth, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and you might be turning to that passage, but several times in that passage, Paul emphasizes the fact that there should be a coming together to observe the Lord's Supper. Now, I would ask this question: do we read about any other circumstances in the New Testament? I've not found any passage that talks about partaking of the Lord's Supper in any other kind of setting. Notice what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17. "Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse." Notice verse 18. "For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it." Notice verse 20. "Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper." And then look at verse 33. "Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another." And then finally in verse 34, "But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I will set in order when I come." Notice how many times Paul talks about a coming together to partake of the Lord's Supper. And then secondly, The New Testament indicates that the Lord's Supper is to be eaten together. Notice what Paul says in verses 20 and following. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in eating each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. And then dropping down to verse 33, therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I will set in order when I come. Seems to me, as I read Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, that there were two problems in the church at Corinth relating to their observance of the Lord's Supper. First of all, they had turned that observance into a common meal. And Paul addresses that problem by telling them, eat at home. Have you not houses to eat and to drink in, Paul says. And then he emphasizes the fact that in our observance of the Lord's Supper, we're to do that in remembrance of Christ. But it seems to me that there was a second problem in the church at Corinth, and that is that they were not eating together. And Paul's instruction is to eat together, to wait for one another. So here's the basic argument. Jesus commanded the apostles to eat together when he instituted the Lord's Supper. Paul condemned the divided assembly at Corinth, and he instructed the church at Corinth to eat together. And then Luke tells us in Acts 20 that Paul and the disciples at Troas came together to eat the Lord's Supper. Now, let's apply these principles. Is there a coming together and an eating together? If you're sick at home in the nursing home, you're traveling, you're quarantined with COVID, you've gone on a trip overseas, you're deployed in the military, you're in jail or prison, is there a coming together under those circumstances? Is there an eating together? Well, I don't think any of us can say that you've got either of those two things going on. Well, now then, I'm going to complicate things even more. Because I'm going to throw something into the mix that's really not a part of the original question, but it is a related question. And that is, what about Sunday night communion? The way it is traditionally done in churches of Christ. Now, I realize that has no application to us here at Courtland right now because we're not assembling on Sunday night. We have in the past. We might do that at some time in the future. And so here's the question. Should the Lord's Supper be offered to a few on Sunday night who could not partake on Sunday morning while everyone else watches and waits? I think we all understand that the Bible teaches that we're to do everything according to the pattern. And when you compare Sunday morning communion, that's what that SMC stands for, with Sunday night communion, in both of those scenarios, you've got the proper partakers, the Christians, the proper place, the worship assembly, the proper focus. Do this in remembrance of me. The proper purpose, proclaim the Lord's death till he come. The proper day, the first day of the week. The proper elements, the bread and fruit of the vine. But now, what about the proper manner? What about this business of eating together? Are we eating together the way Sunday night communion is traditionally done in churches of Christ? Can we substitute something else? If we're not able to assemble with the saints, can we substitute something else for partaking in the worship assembly? What if we can't get the bread and the fruit of the vine? That can be very difficult in Africa in certain places. If we can't get grape juice, can we substitute grape Kool-Aid? Anybody think we could do that? Well, okay, what about this business of eating together? Can we substitute something else for eating together? The argument that I'm making here is really the same argument that I would make for having elders, a plurality of men serving as pastors in each local church. It's the same argument that I would make with respect to church benevolence for saints only. In other words, the New Testament indicates that as far as the benevolent responsibility of a local church is concerned, that's to be given to Christians. Well, I'm making the same argument with respect to eating the Lord's Supper together. All that we read about in the New Testament is a plurality of elders in a local church. We never read about only one elder. We never read about one bishop with little elders underneath him. We never read about an elder exercising authority outside the local church. We never read about first century churches assisting non-Christians as far as benevolence is concerned. And what we read about as far as the Lord's Supper is concerned is a coming together and an eating together. Well, somebody says, wait a minute, preacher. The argument that you're making would demand that we observe the Lord's Supper in an upper room. Jesus commanded the apostles to find an upper room, and the church in Troas met in an upper room. Remember, Eutychus fell out of a third-story window. That's all we read about is assembling in an upper room. Therefore, eating the Lord's Supper in an upper room is essential. If you're going to make this argument that you've just made, then you're going to have to say we got to observe the Lord's Supper in an upper room. Well, let me respond to that objection. First of all, Jesus did not command an upper room. He merely told the disciples that the guest room that would be provided for them to observe the Passover in would be an upper room. That's a pretty significant difference. And then secondly, there is no indication that the Christians in Troas met in an upper room because that had been specified by Jesus or one of the apostles or one of his inspired prophets. And then thirdly, I would point out that the New Testament indicates that first century churches met in various places. The church in Jerusalem met in the temple. Don't think there would have been an upper room large enough to accommodate 3,000 Christians, and the number grew significantly. We're told that Paul met with the disciples in Ephesus in the school of Tyrannus. There's no way to know whether that school had an upper room. We know from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 that the church in Corinth was evidently meeting in some public place. After all, he says, have you not houses to eat and to drink in? Those houses were something different than where they were assembling. And then, of course, we read several times in the New Testament that there were churches that met in private homes. No way for us to know whether those private homes had an upper room. So I don't really think that this objection is very strong. In addition to that, I would point out that in Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, he taught her that the place of worship was not going to be important. Remember, she asked Jesus the question whether they should worship in Mount Gerizim, that's where the Samaritans worshipped, or in Jerusalem. And in response to her question, Jesus said, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship. For salvation is of the Jews, but the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." So basically, I have presented two arguments to suggest that when Christians partake of the Lord's Supper, that is something they should do together. First of all, I have suggested that the New Testament indicates that there is a coming together to observe the Lord's Supper. And then secondly, sure looks to me like Paul emphasizes the fact that the Lord's Supper is something that should be eaten together. Again, I would ask, in the scenarios that we mentioned at the beginning of this study, you're sick at home, you're in the nursing home, you're traveling, you can't assemble with the saints, you're in the military, etc., etc. You really don't have a coming together in those situations. And then secondly, you don't have an eating together. Now, if coming together and eating together is a part of the New Testament pattern, are we following the pattern when we partake under those scenarios that I've just described, or the way Sunday night communion is traditionally observed in churches of Christ? Well, that's one side, and I've not said everything that I could say about that. There's another side. What did I say about hearing both sides? I said we need to do that, right? I don't have time to present the second side this morning. And so I think what I'm going to do is we're going to have a What is Written study part 2 next Sunday. And we'll look at some arguments for the other side. I probably ought to just not say what I was thinking about saying. Remember, we need to approach any difficult question, any controversial question, with an open mind and an open Bible. So, you should not come to any conclusions because you've only heard one side. Hope you'll be interested in hearing the second side. And then you'll have to weigh the arguments, pro and con, for each view. Certainly, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk with you privately, and don't be scared of me. I'm a nice guy. I think you can talk to me, even if you disagree. And so I think we're going to leave it here. I have about 5 minutes in my time, but that's not nearly enough time to even get started. So we'll pause in this study. I hope you can see why this might be a bit difficult and why this might be controversial in the minds of many people. Thank you for your very kind and careful attention.